Yeah, in this session, I'm going to be talking about the Christian middle way, so the application of the middle way to Christianity, and I'll be talking initially maybe for 30-40 minutes. We'll see how it goes, and then but I do want to do a little bit of breakout discussion later on and get your ideas and questions and so on. I'm going to share PowerPoint, which I hope you'll be able to see. So what you can see on the PowerPoint, oh, sorry, I just need to admit more people. Yeah, okay. So I hope what you can see on the PowerPoint is the front of my book, The Christian Middle Way, which is what I'm going to say is based on. So this book was published in 2018. Perhaps I'll tell you a little bit about how it came about, really, because it might give you something to start with, as it were. Okay, so basically, well, my background is a Christian background. So I was brought up in a Baptist background. My father was a missionary in Congo and then a Baptist minister in this country. But as a child, I was quite rebellious and, well, intellectually anyway, and declared myself an atheist at the age of 9. So from that point, I had a kind of love-hate relationship with Christianity. There was a sense in which it was important to me, and but also an intellectual rejection of it. And then, well, to cut a long story short, then I later became involved in Buddhism for about 20 years, and then I was developing the middle way philosophy approach, and wrote a lot of stuff about that. So the middle way approach was kind of fully defined in a number of books before I started thinking about Christianity again. And I think what kind of stimulated that most probably for me was the death of my father. So that was in 2015. So when my father died, as these things often do, I think when your parents die, you start thinking about, well, what do they actually mean to you? And in what ways were they important? And so my father was very associated for me with Christianity, obviously. And it began to make me reflect on the importance of Christianity. Not that I hadn't been doing that before, but it made it crystallize my thoughts about the subject. And I had thought for a long time that the middle way, in principle, could be applied in the context of any tradition. So I really wanted to prove that and to show that the middle way can be used as a universal principle in the context of any tradition. That although obviously the main associations people are likely to have with it is Buddhism, there was such a thing as a Christian middle way. So I set out to develop that and clarify what it might mean. So this book was the result. I'm not sure that the book has found its audience yet. So I'm very glad if you decide you want to read it after this, I'll be very pleased, because it hasn't really, well, I really hadn't got back, I suppose, what I'd like to from it, which is a debate about, to try and stimulate a debate about the Christian middle way. So, yeah, I'm just having a bit of a technical issue here. That's okay. Right. So, yeah, the approach that I'm taking, I suppose, to traditions generally is what I call critical universalism. So I'm a universalist in the sense that I think you can find some resources in any complex tradition, including religious traditions, which will help you in the practice of the middle way. That doesn't mean all traditions are the same, or even all traditions are equally useful. But yeah, all complex traditions offer some resources when critically considered. So one needs to go through a sorting process and think, well, what does this actually, how does this help us? The question will then be, because a religious tradition is a complex thing that's adapted itself to long-term human needs in various ways, how has it adapted itself in helpful ways? And obviously, for some people, obviously, the Christianity and other major religions are immediately identified with dogma. And as I outlined this morning, those of you who are in the session this morning, the middle way is very much about avoiding dogma and avoiding absolutization. So it's separating out the dogma from the helpful elements is, I think, the crucial process in finding the Christian middle way. Now, in order to make sense of that process, I think I'll need to start by talking a bit about meaning and belief, because it's the distinction between meaning and belief that's central to being able to do something like talking about the Christian middle way. And that depends very much on a particular account of meaning, which could be broadly called the embodied meaning thesis, which has become a central part of middle way philosophy. So the embodied meaning thesis takes the view that meaning for us is developed through associations as we develop. So the picture of in the slide, the child and a tree, is just an example, so an illustration. So if you imagine a child, perhaps one that's actually a bit younger than the one pictured there, but the child who is first encountering a tree and is getting used to the idea that there's an association between the word tree and this thing. So that child will have a rich and active experience of what a tree is, because they've got a body and they're doing things and they're exploring it. So they might touch the tree, touch the bark, they might go inside it like this one. They might interact with the tree in various ways. So that's what tree then means in the experience of that child. It's based on a link between a symbol, in this case the word tree, and a set of experiences. And you could then, in later, as you go on, as you develop, you can elaborate that meaning in different ways. So the term tree can be elaborated through metaphor. You can talk about a family tree, for example, which is a metaphorical extension of the idea of the branches of a tree as we might encounter them in the physical tree. So tree there, the meaning of tree comes from experience and the associations we've made. In brain terms, the synaptic links we've made with that experience, between the symbol and the experience. It's not, the meaning of it isn't something that is deduced from propositions or looked up in a dictionary. It's something rooted in our bodies and nervous systems. And the emotive and cognitive elements of it are indivisible. That's an important element of the embodied meaning thesis. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is that the central concern, obviously, in Christianity is God. So I want to suggest that the meaning of God is similar to the meaning of tree for this child. So if people talk about God, there's some sort of experience which is a rooted, active human experience, which relates to what they're talking about. Obviously, there's a lot of different things you can say about what that experience might be, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. But that there is some kind of experience that makes the word God or the symbol of God important to people. It's kind of a good starting point, I think, for trying to appreciate what the Christian middle way might mean. So if we can separate meaning from belief, when talking about God to start with, and indeed talking about other things in Christianity, then that makes a crucial starting point, I think, for a useful approach to the tradition. So, yeah, God as meaning is a set of symbols or associations, including words, which are associated with certain experiences for people. Now, I'll try and talk in rough terms about what that experience might be. You may have your own experiences and ideas about what you think it means. So I'd want to suggest it's a basic experience of potentiality and openness, possibly challenge and awe, but it goes beyond our current identifications and our current assumptions. So it's really, I suppose, one way you could summarize it is that we're bigger than we think we are. So our experience is potentially bigger than the ways we might reduce it and try and pinpoint it at any one point. And then, so you can talk about religious experience, and there's a lot of debate about religious experience in philosophy and psychology and so on. And there's also neuroscience of religious experience, all of which can sort of feed in, I think, to our understanding of it. But broadly, if we're going to try and talk about God as experience, we'd have to take into account that it could have lots of different intensities. It might be a full-blown, life-changing experience you have in a short time, or it might just be a slight sense of openness or new potentiality or new meaning in your life or something of that kind. You can also talk about it in brain terms. So one very interesting figure who I think can shed light on this is the neuroscientist Jill Bolte-Taylor, who I guess Ian McGilchrist might possibly mention in his sessions. So Jill Bolte-Taylor was a neuroscientist who had a stroke in her left hemisphere and had this amazing experience of release of all these sort of little conceptual assumptions that we live by that are activated particularly by the prefrontal cortex of our left hemispheres. And so she had this sort of oceanic experience of vast openness and awe and so on, which can be associated with religious experiences as they're often described. There's also talk by neuroscientists of the stimulation of the limbic system and so on. So when people have near-death experiences, then their limbic system goes into overdrive. So there are various ways of trying to describe religious experience, but what joins them together, I think, is just the idea that there's a certain openness and potentiality involved. And so when we talk about God as meaning, we're linking experiences like that to symbols of some kind. So if that's the case, if that's what we can at least mean by God, then experience and meaning of God don't require absolute beliefs. So the way that Christians and others have often talked about God is to start with absolute beliefs about him, and then I think deduce what God means from that, or in dependence on it. But if we start with the meaning first and the experience first, we don't have to think in that way. So if you have an experience, whatever the nature of that experience, in a way it's just an experience. You don't have to necessarily categorize it in a particular way to start with. So there's a Buddhist quotation from the Sutta Nipata, I think, in the seen, only the seen, which is just conveys the idea that okay, you've had this great experience, so just appreciate it as that for a moment before you jump to conclusion. Oh, that was God, and this was a revelation, or whatever you want to say more about it. When we've had an experience, of course, we would then want to associate it with symbols that are meaningful to us. And of course, those symbols are going to be the ones that are culturally available to us. So when I had what I might call religious experiences around the age of 18 or 19, at that time, the only language I had to talk about them was God language. So I thought, well, this must be an experience of God. Maybe that's what my parents were on about. But I now realize there were lots of other possible ways of talking about them, those experiences, including Buddhist ones. So Buddhists may talk about jhana experiences of intense positive emotion and intense focus and intense mindfulness. So these kinds of experiences will be expressed in particular ways. But obviously the label that God then is contingent. It's a contingent label for that God experience. There's lots of other things you could call it. And if you're brought up in, say, traditional Chinese culture, it wouldn't even occur to you to talk in terms of God, because that's just not a major concept in that culture. And obviously in the modern West, you may prefer not to talk about God. You may be allergic to talk about God in some cases. So I certainly know some people like that, like people who had a bad time in a Catholic boarding school when they were children or whatever. So then absolute beliefs, which use that idea, God, like beliefs about God's existence, or beliefs that God gave us a revelation, gave us a new truth through our experience, and so on, I want to suggest have a completely contingent relationship with God experience and God meaning. So there's no requirement to associate the two. Of course, that also goes for the neuroscientific labels. So I'm not suggesting experiences of God are just anything. I'm not suggesting they're just stimulation of the limbic system or whatever. Neuroscientific labels give us another angle, another sort of set of experiences by people who are observing from outside, from the neuroscientific point of view. And I think there's a useful way to tell us a bit more, but they don't tell us everything. So the value and importance of experience and its meaning is not undermined in the least by being disassociated from absolute beliefs. Now, I guess my impression is that this is just not a widely appreciated idea, that this might be the case. So that's what I'm basically trying to say here, that you can really appreciate what God is about without believing in it. That would be a shortcut way of putting it. If you want a further indication of that, then Jung's Red Book, which I'm going to talk about tomorrow evening, gives you another way into that, because I think the Red Book is another piece of evidence of somebody who had he didn't have a set of absolute beliefs about what he was experiencing, not just Jung, but still had quite amazing experiences, which one would call, to all intents and purposes, religious. Okay, so what is God then? This God that we're talking about as a symbol. So I want to suggest that God is an archetype. So here are some pictures of different kinds of symbols that can be associated with that archetype. So you've got, well, on the right-hand side, there's a Russian icon of, which is often associated anyway with the Trinity. There's also a picture of the Buddha. There's what I think is quite a striking photograph of that was captioned by the photographer, Wise Old Woman. So it seems to me quite a good depiction of a wise old woman as an archetypal figure. There's Guru Nanak from Sikhism, who's the old man with the beard, and there's a mandala. So there's quite an impersonal version. So all of these could be symbols for us, archetypal symbols of this openness and potentiality, but whether we want to use them will obviously depend on our experience and our culture. So this, what do we mean by an archetype? So an archetype, I'm going to suggest, is a function that helps us meet our needs over time by inspiring us over time. So basically, we're quite distractible, forgetful creatures as humans, and if we have sort of a glimpse of how things could be better and how we can improve things and how we can change and make better judgments, then we're inclined to forget from one moment to another, let alone one day to another. So we need reminders, and that's where archetypes come in. So the archetypes, we might put them up on the wall, we might worship them every Sunday or whatever it is, but however we come into contact with them, they provide us with this dose of inspiration that reminds us that we're bigger than we think we are. Whether that's a dose of inspiration coming from what we call God or from some other concept or symbol that basically does the same kind of work. So supposing you put that picture of the wise old woman, I think might be from Mali or somewhere like that, if you were inspired by that and put it up on your wall, that might to some extent fulfill the same function for you. If it helped you to recollect something that's important and inspiring when you looked at it. Okay, so if we're going to take ideas like this about archetypes and separating meaning from belief and apply them to Christianity, I think that implies what I call interpretative responsibility. So Christian tradition gives us all kinds of stuff, obviously including a long tradition of dogma and a great deal of ritual and biblical interpretation on which that's based. So to interpret responsibly, I would suggest, means interpreting practically. So we don't have to be bound by traditional authority in the Christian tradition, or indeed by historical scholarship, which can be another sort of holy cow, really, I think. So these things may provide us with stimulus, may provide us with new ideas and interesting ways in, but the ultimate question is, how does this help? What's its practical effect? Not its practical effect just in the short term, but in the long term. So how does it help us maintain our inspiration? How does this symbol help to inspire us over time? So you could ask that question, for example, about that picture of the Annunciation. Maybe it doesn't help inspire you over time. For me, that picture does, but obviously that's maybe particular to me. So the principle of interpretive responsibility, I suppose, is the basis of the kind of interpretation of the Christian tradition that I offered in my book, The Christian Middle Way. Now, I'm just going to give you, I'm going to talk a bit about Christ as an example of that. Yeah? So what I would suggest is an application of that symbol to, an application of that principle to Christ. And a bit later, I'm going to get you to do a bit of interpreting for yourselves and do a bit of discussion. So Christ as a symbol of the middle way, I think is it's a rich symbol. So I suppose a lighting on this interpretation of Christ, largely through Jungian kinds of thinking, although Jung doesn't quite say it very directly. It's a little bit in the Red Book. You could get this idea. For me, it's been really liberating, I think, to think of Christ in this way, because I could immediately then think, well, actually, this is why people have found this helpful. and it's not just this weird set of beliefs about atonement or whatever that for me, for a lot of my life, were pretty abstract and alienating. So that really helps to bring alive the Christian tradition, which is still very much part of Western culture, whether or not you're directly involved in it, churches or whatever. So some aspects of Christ as a symbol of the middle way. So Christ is neither godlike or neither divine nor human. At the same time, he's both divine and human. So in terms of the Nicene Creed, he is divine and human. So the Nicene Creed, as you might have spotted if you've ever recited it or looked at it, is totally contradictory in logical terms. It insists that Christ is both human and divine at the same time, that he's both perfect and imperfect. But what you've got there, I hope, or what I think you can interpret that is creative ambiguity. So the middle way can be symbolized in various ways. It's often symbolized as a kind of navigation or a process of working between two extremes. But you can also, I think, interpret it or symbolize it as ambiguity, creative ambiguity. And ambiguity in the wrong place can be very unhelpful. If you need to make a clear-cut decision, it can be unhelpful. But when it comes to inspiration, it can be very helpful actually just to accept ambiguity and indeed revel in it. So Christ as a symbol is basically reminding us of ways that we can at the same time hold in mind our ideals as meaning and our human limitations as our starting point. So yeah, it's an inspiration, you could say, to bridge the gap by both fully recognizing our humanity and at the same time finding our ideals fully meaningful. So, if God is put into dogmatic language, then we just feel, well, we can't have anything to do with that. This is way beyond us. But if we can find a creative ambiguity way of relating to God, then Christ as a symbol might help us to do that. So as part of this, obviously the biggest symbols in relation to Christ are the crucifixion and the resurrection, which was celebrated recently by Christians at Easter. So the crucifixion is, I think, can be helpfully interpreted as a kind of point of hopeless frustration where we think all is lost. But it actually can be a point of creative release. So giving up on a fixed view of how things are because it's failing us in some way can feel like the loss of everything. So again, it's about having to look beyond what we think we are and recognizing that we're bigger than we think we are. And as we do that, it might feel like a crucifixion, metaphorically speaking. It's a point of hopeless frustration, but then the crucifixion has to be paired with the resurrection symbolically, because the resurrection symbolizes the breakthrough, the point of unexpected change when we reframe, when we start thinking differently because our whole way of thinking has changed, and we sort of come through into another area, another zone, if you like. Okay, so that for me at least helps to explain why Christians throughout the ages have found this so important. That it's not just its doctrinal reduction. So it would be possible to work through lots of different aspects of Christianity in this way, which is what my book does if you're interested in that. So I could talk about interpretations of the creation story, for example, about Jesus's miracles, and indeed about other aspects of Christian ritual and so on. But rather than go through a great deal of that, which you can read if you're interested in it, I thought best use of the remainder of this session really is to focus on a specific example, get you to discuss it a bit, and see if what kind of interpretation you might come up with, particularly if we're thinking, well, we're trying to make a responsible interpretation, a helpful interpretation, practical one of a particular aspect of the Christian tradition. So the example I want to use is baptism. So I'm hoping that you'll all know at least a little bit about this, though obviously experiences will vary. My own familiarity with baptism comes from obviously having been the son of a Baptist minister and seeing people being baptized, adults being baptized in a baptismal pool, in a service. But it's even for the vast majority of Christian denominations use infant baptism, christening as it's often called. But I believe some of those also do adult baptism as well on some occasions. So the main thing perhaps to focus on is baptism as it appears in the Bible and as it is used in the church. What might it mean? So if you're trying to adopt a helpful attitude to this, you might need to be aware of the traditional dogmas and what it generally means to Christians. But what do you think is the most helpful way of interpreting it, which relates to human experience most fully, rather than obviously the perpetuating absolute views? Okay, so I'm going to try and put you in breakout groups and see what you think of that. And then we'll come back with your idea. So I'll give you about 10 minutes, see what you can come up with about baptism. And then we'll have a bit of feedback on that. And we might have a bit of time for other questions about the journey. Okay, so open to you now, really. So maybe you've got a spokesman from the group, or maybe you've just got an individual idea. Maybe you've got some ideas about interpretation of baptism, or maybe you've got a wider point about the topic. If you'd like to raise a hand or another non-verbal signal, and I'll unmute you, or you could have just unmute yourself probably. Actually, you should be able to unmute yourself and just speak out. Anyone like to report back a bit?
Hi, Robert.
Hi.
Brendan. Okay.
Hi,
so yes, had a very interesting discussion in our group. I think we came to a few ideas. I think it was stimulated some ideas for all of us. The first thing that came up was the idea that baptism was an embodied experience. Even if it happens to you as a child, it's a physical happening. It's something that you can go back to as a real event. So it's embodied. It has that sense of embodiment to it. It involves a sense of community and being involved in a community, and that community can last and being a part of something. There was the sense of cleansing, the spiritual idea of cleansing and purifying, blanking the sheet out, and so that you can then restart. And also we were thinking around the idea of intentionality, where somebody chooses to be baptized in some traditions later in life, and it's setting an intention to follow a different faith or to take on certain precepts or parts of that faith as well. So so I don't know if that's what we're looking for here, but
yeah, sure. So it's symbolic, isn't it? And it's providing you with, well, a symbol for a transformation of your life or positive transformation of your life. Yeah. Did you discuss the water element there?
Didn't really get specifically into the water now.
Okay. Anyone else got ideas about the water baptism? How could we interpret it helpfully?
Hello?
Oh, hello.
Oh, was it?
Was someone else trying to do something?
No, do come in.
Okay. Lovely woman whose name I don't actually know, I think her name's Susan, was saying that she was thinking of the water that's kind of like the fluid that you get when you're born.
Embryonic.
Amniotic fluid?
Amniotic.
So like relating the water of baptism to a rebirth in quite a like literal, like earthy way. And I thought that was quite interesting. So like that it's kind of connected to the sort of Mother Earth sort of idea, or Mother Sea or Lake, and that
Okay.
it's like another way of starting your life again, but in quite a sort of similar way as you started the first time.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean that probably connects just to the idea that, well, fluidity, is connected for us with change, isn't it? So we expect liquid to be more movable than solid stuff. So the idea of immersing ourselves in something more fluid and movable suggests change, and it could symbolize change for us. In particularly if we want to commit ourselves to a long-lasting, helpful change, that will be one way of symbolizing it. Okay, great. Anybody else like to come in either on baptism or perhaps on more general issues, if you have any points you want to make or questions you want to ask?
Susan and I were talking about the sort of continuity from the Jewish tradition through to Christianity. So it's almost like baptism is a relic of that connection, really, which I really, I find that quite inspiring, and kind of reaching back into history.
Right. Yeah. So that's, history having a symbolic significance is an interesting thing there. So I'm having a bit of a debate about this with Brian Pierce, who was left with me after everyone else was allocated to it. So I think we disagreed on this, but the for me, there's a distinction between appealing to history to give you a set of beliefs that got to be true, and getting inspiration from history. So something like a symbolic historical link can inspire you and make a difference to your life because of the associations you have with it. And that's where historical exploration might be particularly fruitful.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else like to come in there?
Oh, he probably doesn't see me.
Yeah, can see it.
Oh, you do? Can I?
Yeah,
okay.
I can. Yeah.
Well, we also, I was talking about, there's a place in Boston, it's a mikveh, which is what Jews dunk in, that's been transformed from the old Orthodox way. It's completely new age kind of, if you have a change in your life, you're getting divorced, it can be anything. You're retiring. There are people who volunteer and help you develop your own ritual, and then you do the actual official dunking, which is 3 times totally under the water, and say the words you choose to say. It's very middle way. It's all based on your own experience and what you want to see happening.
Wow.
So they're actually doing this activity of choosing a transition from one part of their life to another, letting go of the past, and choosing to affirm what they want to see happen in the future. But it's done in a very non-absolute way, and in fact very much opposed to the they have to have their own mikveh, because in an official Orthodox one, there are all these rules that are extremely absolute, that are not, it's not possible to really do it in a middle way. So
Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. I didn't realize that people are basically doing sort of do-it-yourself baptism, rather like do-it-yourself weddings, where you make your own vows. Okay. Anyone else want to come in there? Any other points?
Yeah, I wonder if I could just make a comment.
Yeah.
When you started, you were talking about starting from experience, and then the experience, and then got the name of God, if you like, and that kind of development. Strikes me, listening to other people, that this is almost taking the symbol, the baptism or whatever it is, but taking the symbol and making the symbol the experience, experiencing, embodying somehow the symbol, and therefore a symbolic action which gives you something back. And that's what baptism seems to be. It's actually taking a symbol, acting out a ritual, and then getting something back from it. In other words, the other way around, taking the symbol and creating the experience from the symbol rather than the experience making the symbol.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, it's an interdependency, isn't it? The two feed into each other all the time, and like people say, art imitates life and life imitates art. So we create symbols of things, and they affect what we previously assumed to be reality, so the reality was independent. And obviously the same applies to religious traditions. Okay. Any other points? We've got time for about one more person if you'd like to ask anything or make a comment.
It's Brian. Can I add a comment?
Sure.
I mean, I think the discussion that we had and some of the comments that we've just been listening to illustrates the fact that for some people, the historical roots of a tradition will be of considerable importance. For others, in fact, to shift away from those roots and to feel that something new is being created are equally valid, but they're different ways of framing one's understanding.
So what do you mean by something new being created there? So you're talking about people starting a new church, for example?
I mean, one as you will know, I mean, a major category which has emerged in recent years is the category of spiritual but not religious. Now, that's a very interesting movement, but it's for people who want to have some spiritual dimension within their lives, and which they recognize and act upon, but without having, as it were, to yoke themselves to a particular religious tradition. Now, there will be other people who find the strength being in a particular religious tradition and finding that of value and wrestling with that. It isn't that one is an appropriate route and the other isn't. They're different ways of seeking for meaning. Yeah,
sure. I mean that's about starting where you start, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah.
So people already, for example, committed to a particular religious tradition, that's where they are. And I think the probably better and worse ways of working, even with fundamentalism, which is, it's obviously got these strong absolute elements, just as there perhaps more obviously are with more liberal interpretations.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, I could just wave a book I've read recently about this, which I found really helpful, which is Spirit and Flesh by James Alt, which is a sociologist's account of life in a fundamentalist Baptist church. And what's so interesting about that is he actually shows lots of ways that fundamentalists are quite flexible. They really can't live up to all the absolutes they say they believe in a lot of the time. But for me, it also showed the archetypal function of a lot of their fundamentalist beliefs, that they're meaningful for them, and that's the function they actually seem to play for them.
But of course, the structure of the tradition is also important. And one thing which people don't realize is that actually within the Baptist tradition, as you may know, individual churches have been left to make their own decisions on same-sex marriages. And people don't realize that that's going on within the Baptist Church, because the Baptist Church may be seen as, on the whole, being more conservative.
Yeah. Oh, well, Baptists vary a great deal. Yeah. Okay, well, we're out of time, I'm afraid, but so thank you all very much for coming along to this. And just to flag up that if you'd like to continue the discussion at all, then if you go to the Middle Way Society website, there's a forum. You click on the right-hand side. If you want to ask any further questions or share any other thoughts, then I'll be happy to respond to that. And I'll try and put up my PowerPoint there. Obviously, if you feel like reading the book, that would be great as well. Freely available on Amazon and other places. Okay, so thank you very much, and hopefully see you in other events in the rest of the festival.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.